sorry, just forgot to hit start. Hey, this is Adam Swan with SOC Prime. I'm here with Nate, and today we're going to be talking about MITRE ATT&CK coverage. Before we get going, we do have a new challenge this month. So let me just introduce the challenge here real quick.
Right before Thanksgiving, right?
Right before Thanksgiving, yeah. It is a Thanksgiving themed challenge, actually. So it's challenge 3. If you have some time over this break, you might give this a try. It shouldn't be too difficult. But basically, there's a script in here, and you can just go to something like CyberChef to decode it, and we'll take a quick look, and maybe I'll give you a hint about what's going on.
The hint is always use the magic function, right?
Yeah. So you can see it's just a Python script here. And there's basically, it's some simple analysis that you have to do of the script to figure out how to reverse what the password is. It should be pretty accomplishable to anyone who has any experience doing this. And even for most people, if you don't have experience analyzing code, it should still be. So it's interesting. No one so far has solved the previous challenge, so that one's also up for grabs if you guys want to give that one a shot. So we're still looking for challenge 2, a winner. So that one's available. But once someone solves them, we're going to go over what the answers were. Or what the answers are. So let's go ahead and talk about coverage. So what do we mean by coverage in MITRE, using MITRE ATT&CK or not, right? It doesn't really matter. You're not forced to use MITRE. It's just a knowledge base there and a schema to help you answer some of these questions. But really, like, coverage is, I know a lot of people say that security isn't a checklist, but unfortunately, like, the checklist technique, it works. Like, as long as you still have that, you're still using human intuition and your brains a little bit when you're going about performing the checklist. Like, checklists work. That really becomes a problem when people are just like focused only on checking boxes and not really paying attention to what matters, right? So, but that's what coverage is, right? So we have some techniques to do it. MITRE ATT&CK is probably the de facto standard now. A lot of CISOs out there are asking their employees, hey, I want to have complete coverage of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then it's up to us to go out there and figure out, okay, how do we do that? So it's kind of by default, a lot of us are forced into that mode of, hey, we just want to cover every tactic. But then there's a lot of people out there who are taking it kind of a step further, and they're saying, okay, well, we want to cover everything, but what matters the most? So they're looking at who's targeting them, and which is actually, you can get some of that data from MITRE itself. They have a lot of information about adversaries and what they're doing. But also you have to pay attention, maybe have your own intelligence shop to do this to make it more useful. But they're looking at what adversaries are doing that might target them or have targeted them. And then they are prioritizing those techniques. So this one is interesting because really depending on how much data you have about who's targeting you, or like how mature your intelligence operation is, if you have one, like, it can be super useful or it can be very misleading. Because if you don't have a super mature intel, you might go out and decide, like, okay, well, I'm worried about APT 29, and they've used PowerShell in the past, so I'm just going to focus on PowerShell. Well, really, like, largely, adversaries have moved away from using PowerShell because it's so noisy and blue teams are good at detecting it. So, like, if you focus all your energy on PowerShell, you might actually be missing out on things. So if you don't have a really good intelligence shop, like one of the better things you can do is just look at general trends in the industry. There's a lot of yearly and quarterly reporting that comes out that's just like, hey, over the past 6 months, we've observed this sort of activity. And a lot of times you'll see the same things over and over again. You're going to see PowerShell on that list, but you're also going to see like people exploiting remote services. You're going to see phishing over and over again, but maybe you see something new like squibbly do or some sort of new attack that's going to help you understand like what are crimeware organizations coming out, because most of us face more targeting from these crimeware folks rather than necessarily nation state.
Yeah, or just crimeware is used as the initial access. Like I always like to say, like is you're a nation state. Why you don't think that some of them don't just pay $5 to, gain access to a computer via some crimeware botnet? People selling access to 100 computers, and you can sort by organizations and so forth. So that was always something that really, well, speaking of Intel, right, like kind of disappointed me about certain organizations or places I worked that I had really good intel, but I legitimately heard, well, we don't care about that because that's not a nation state. And then circa like 3 or 4 years later, right, we've all read the story of APT 28 and 29, leveraging, was it Zeus or whatever botnet, right? Like why would these nation states burn, a 0 day or burn being attributed back to their infrastructure, their country, so on and so forth. So just even trends too, like email people still think is like the number one, or the 80 or the vast majority, 80 or 90% access into an organization. That trend has kind of changed in the last year or two, especially now with everybody working remote. Like somehow, somewhere along the lines, people have really forgotten about public-facing web servers and databases and VPNs. I think that's changed as incident reports have come out, but for a long time, detection is primarily focused on the assumption somebody opening an email, so, or just forgetting the assumption that you just pay an employee $70,000 to reset some passwords, which I'll kind of talk about later.
Yeah. So if we want to talk about coverage and we're talking about these techniques, well, there's a lot of resources out there. There's two different, most of them are targeted towards data sources, right? So people are worried about coverage and they go, okay, well, what telemetry do I have that covers these techniques? How will I be able to detect this based off of the telemetry that I can get? So there's a lot of resources out there. I think the first person to talk about using MITRE in this way was probably Roberto Rodriguez. Twitter handle CyberWarDog. Excellent follow on Twitter if you're not following him.
Yeah, and I think shortly after that was like Andre at Luxembourg talk about like mapping MITRE to Sigma and so on. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but yeah, usually, him or especially Roberto, anything.
Yeah.
Just be following him.
Yeah, so there's a few projects here, and these slides will be available, but I just wanted to highlight two of them that I think are pretty useful for doing this. One of them is Olaf Harthong's attack data map. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a really advanced Excel spreadsheet that you complete, and it helps you create one of those attack navigator JSON files that you can upload and take a look at and have a nice visualization. But it also helps you think through the process of how your data sources are performing for you. And then there's also Detect, which is a bit more involves new services and software in your environment, but it is a little bit more robust and has nice visualizations, and it's they're both pretty nice. I've used both of them now. So, but recently MITRE also changed their schema to include more information about data sources. So if you haven't read this article, Roberto's brother, Jose Rodriguez, right, Nate? I think so. Sorry if I got that wrong.
Or
but
Cyber Panda, yeah.
Yeah, Cyber Panda. Yeah, he helped them improve their schema, and that's a good read regarding data sources. But when it comes to content, unfortunately, we're kind of at the will of ourselves who are writing the content, or at the will of the people who are developing it, and we're kind of taking their word for it that this piece of content maps to this technique. But every time, this is something that we're going to run into a lot with attack, is every time you use attack in a new way, you're actually kind of losing a little bit of information. Like, it's kind of like when you go from machine code to assembly, you lose a little bit of information. When you go from assembly to compile to like uncompiled code, you like C, for instance, you lose even more information. So like, it's kind of in that same way. When you start tagging content with MITRE ATT&CK tags, like, you're not necessarily saying that this piece of content covers this technique entirely, right? So it's something to be aware of, and we're going to be talking about that more in this presentation. So the other thing is, like, going after the attack model of doing this isn't necessarily like the end all be all, right? There's other things that you can't just go into it with the attack model and start filling out check boxes by looking at your SIM, right? You have to actually know, like, your environment. You have to know, hey, are all my logs making it into my SIM, or is there stuff in the cloud that's only making it to Sentinel that I don't know about? What about things that aren't even on the domain? Like, do I have some people in marketing who are spinning up websites on their own and not telling anyone about it? Is a common problem. So there's those sorts of issues, and then there's also like the knowledge of the golden nuggets, that the common term, I don't know how good of a term it is, but those golden pieces of information or assets or processes that are critical to your environment, like, need to weigh in how you're prioritizing what techniques you want to cover, not just necessarily what adversaries are coming after, right? So Nate's going to get into more of that, I think, in a few minutes, but then obviously knowledge of your adversaries, and then it requires layers of defensive telemetry and content. Like, I think Samir from Elastic recently said, like, it's nice to have at least 2 pieces of detection content for every technique. And I'm going to use technique in quotes here because I'll get into later, like, techniques have different, or some of the techniques are very broad and some of them are very narrow, where you can actually get away with less detection content for them, but some of them are like this amorphous thing. So we'll get into more of that later. So Nate's going to get us started on focusing on what matters.
All right. Oh, turn my camera back. Yeah. So nobody can respond. I can't hear you, but how many of us have like looked at attack, or just looked at our job as a whole and just been said, like, where do I even begin? I think everybody kind of has, unless you work for a big organization with the best, boss in the world. I think all of us kind of in some fashion are in a situation where we don't have a lot of time, right? We need quick wins and things like that. So at the end of the day, like, security, as I've always said, like, security doesn't make an organization money, unless you are like an MSSP, or sell a product. But most of us are just defending, a network or a company, right, that doesn't sell those sort of things. And again, at the end of the day, the business, the bottom line, the money is unfortunately that all that matters, quote unquote. Not to say that is in a, like, depressing way, because obviously there is more in what you do and things like that. But I think getting that fundamental, in your head when you start building detections, that are worthwhile, that last, is important. Most importantly, because you're just not going to be able to catch everything. You're not going to be able to just defend every single asset. I always take a story back to like, patching, and it kind of hit me when I think it was Jessica Payne or, her or some other kind of big wig or big shot within Microsoft was just like, yeah, well, what do you do about a person who travels, turns their laptop off for 2 weeks? Do you just not allow them back on the network and so on? Yeah, like most people say, well, that's why we have, zero trust and they have to go through this and that. But again, like we're in reality here, and not everybody's stuff is going to be patched 100% of the time. So again, just focusing on what matters to the business is going to help you. So I know a lot of people kind of say I can be negative, but that's unfortunately my characteristic of taking on too big of problems or trying to solve, pretty immense tasks, which brings me to my next slide, Adam, or hopefully they're in order. Oh, nope, one after that. Yeah, they're out of order. Yeah, so complex problems, are really just lots of small solutions. I think a lot of us probably understand using something like Trello or Notion or Jira or something, right? You create an epic or a board, and then you have a lot of small tasks like cybersecurity, defending, all of those things. It needs to be thought with that same sort of methodology, right? Like Adam talked about it being a to-do list. Sure, not a to-do list with always a box that has like a to be determined, right? Because it's a continuous process of learning and so forth, which again kind of mentioned later on. But just the whole goal, right, like is to not be overwhelmed. I'm talking about this from experience, right? Like working on a network of logging, defending whatever 2 or 3 million computers, to like being the person who defended 50 computers, but also, had to help fix people's printers because quote unquote the firewall was blocking it or something like that, right? So like we all got enough going on now. Most of us, even before this year, don't have a lot of time. There's enough tools out there. There's enough software. There's enough people. Unfortunately, we might have tricked you, that taking away from this talk that we might have had some like scripts you can run that'll fix everything. But unfortunately, there's just too many scripts, too many tools. And probably the biggest thing that's helped me in defending certain networks that previously I deemed undefendable, right, was kind of going back to a methodology thinking. Adam, you could probably use that word for me. Methodical thinking. So Adam, jump back one more slide. So I think we've all nope, that's two. Yeah, I think we've all probably heard something like this, like what's important to a business. I've never really seen people discuss too much like practical scenarios of what that actually means. Like I remember when this first hit me a couple years back on kind of using this as my way to defend a network. And again, this applies even for MSSPs, right? And so on. This might take a little bit of more time, maybe something you don't want to do, but getting involved in what your company does, finding some data about that company, what's important to them and so on, right? Maybe you pass it on to a manager, or you just, somebody like me who just do it themselves too, just to make their lives easier. But really this is, what's important to a business is really just a thought exercise. Again, like I don't have a tool, I don't have a script, but if you're not always at a keyboard anymore like me, sometimes it's nice to have solutions that you can just literally think about. Not another program to install, not another thing to spend your whole weekend on testing and so on. So story time. I think we got plenty of stories probably fleshed out throughout here. Not gonna spend a whole dedicated section. Go ahead, next one. So yeah, like practically what matters to a business. You got double click on. You forgot to
Sorry
turn
about
your video game setting off. No. Yeah, practically like what matters to a business. Sometimes all that matters is whether companies has uptime, right? Or most importantly, they just have backups. Sometimes that's, I just said over the last couple of years, like some companies don't really need security. They just need backups and uptime. But that doesn't mean you don't have a purpose and that you shouldn't be defending that network, right? Like maybe you can aid, obviously, in detection of something like ransomware would probably be the biggest, example of how you could help defend or catch, let's save time, uptime, right, and backups. But practical examples of like what matters to your business. Like if you sell merchandise or something, right, it's going to be a point of sale system server if you have them. If you're somebody like a Walmart or a Target, that sort of thing, or an online website, you probably don't have a point of sale system because third parties handling that credit card process, right? But you probably have a website. This website, may not have a database. It probably just needs uptime. Maybe it's something as simple as making sure like, their Apache Cold Fusion is updated or people aren't trying to brute force the Apache Cold Fusion login or whatever it is that they're managing the website, right? Because if I have a company that has like 10,000 computers and their website to sell this merchandise is really the bottom line for this company, how many things do I truly need to protect? Like how many things do I truly need to defend? Sure, it would suck if the CEO like had ransomware on his computer or somebody, a 13-year-old kid changed his desktop background to, something inappropriate or whatever it is that's embarrassing to that person. Yeah, but at the end of the day, like that's not going to affect the business's bottom line a week later or a month later, right? So it's narrowing your focus is really what it is. I could basically go from 10,000 computers to really only needing to spend my time defending, one computer or one server, whatever it is. Like this kind of flew in my face when, Adam and I were defending a network that was, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 600 plus administrators, as the network was actively being built out. So I always talked about like, machine learning and like something new being installed on the network. These are administrators like who get called at 3 a.m. while they're on vacation in Istanbul or, off some like money laundering country somewhere in the seas, right? Instead of visiting family or taking a vacation there and logging in at 3 a.m, right? So basically took, 3,000-4,000 servers, broke them down into maybe 10 or 15 that we really needed to protect. Like we didn't even have access into the computers before they VPN'd in. And you remember how that was fun when we actually traced things back to the compromised user, because then after that it was pretty much disappeared. But
yeah, I remember like we caught this red team before they really got any sort of access to the environment, and then we let the company or the other people who a network that they pivoted from that we didn't have insight on. We were like, hey, we know you're compromised because we saw something pivot to us, and then it just disappeared.
Yep, disappeared in thin air. But it would have, it would have made our lives a lot easier. But to have access and insight into everybody's computer before they VPN'd in. But a lot of us have probably defended a website. It's pretty much the same thinking, right? How many do you have access, to install software to see if things are patched, to collect logs from people accessing a public-facing website? No. Like VPN is kind of the same thinking. You just got to change it, right? Then I'm not going to read off these lists, but like thinking of like a college or a university, again, the website, yeah, it'd be disappointing if somebody defaced it. It's probably going to happen anyways. But usually it's research and intellectual property. So like just go and find where the file servers are. You don't need to necessarily defend every college student's laptop and the 3,000 professors and everything else. Like go and find where the heck the server is, or the file shares, the databases that have the intellectual property and the research. Don't go and ask that. That's, hey, can I have access to a server that has the the research you guys are doing to discover a cure for such and such? Like that's not going to happen. But if you ask like that, but I think you get the drift. Like break these things down into small Lego blocks, which people don't know. Lego close to my heart. Hit next. I think, yeah, again, not trying to be negative, just trying to break this down and like first kind of show the problem. I think all of us get it, right? That's why we're always constantly on Twitter. It's why we're always constantly reading. So I don't think we need to really describe too much that there's problems, with attack, right? Or just the concept of focusing on only knowns or whatever it is. Or my biggest thing, and I'll probably flesh this out this year at some point, creating like a model. I can't say pre-attack anymore because that is a model. But before log sources and everything like that, and even the kill chain, right? Like if you look at towards after persistence and exfil, like around like later on in the stage, the last stage or the stage before, it becomes real hairy, like real unspecific on what you need to do. And I think this is shown the most in insider threats, right? Like what's the difference between a legitimate user and a malicious user? It's probably just intent. If Adam is a user who's supposed to reset, people's account, okay, he resets accounts. Like how will I find out if he's maliciously resetting accounts? Have I even thought about that? What's the difference? Like I become Adam, or I pay Adam $70,000 to reset a password. What do you do? Who's thinking about that? That stuff is happening. Maybe not. People aren't getting paid money in your environment to do stuff like that. But I think only in the last couple of years have we really heard about this. But I think we all know that's been happening for a long time. I think this kind of.
It's definitely possible. I'm sure most environments have at least seen someone create an administrative local account for another user who's their buddy or something like that, and they just assume that it's the appropriate thing to do. It's I think I've seen that happen at least once in every organization that I've been involved with.
Here's one I've seen, and I don't know where this would fit in a kill chain or a detection, but it's pretty darn easy to detect with a certain Windows event log. But I've seen, but just help desk or administrators just get so frustrated with file share access or something that they'll literally just put in their credentials for that computer, right? And then really to accomplish a lot, because access to domain control or domain admin rights isn't, usually everybody's end goal. You can accomplish what's impactful or resourceful to steal from the business long before then or without it, right? But they just use those credentials to start accessing other file shares. That's about it. Then there might not even be compression. There might not be exfiltration. Or what if you're just exfilling, pulling a phone out of your pocket and then just opening documents and recording it, right? I like to throw kind of things up in the air make you think, there's a lot more going on than what we know, and then we know about it 2 years later. Oh, nobody's attacking routers and switches. Oh, all of a sudden there's Vault 7 dump. Okay, yep, this has been happening for a long time. So just because, basically, if you can dream it, it's been done. You can think it, it's being done. So next slide. All right, good talk, Nate. Thanks. Got nothing to take away. So I do have takeaways. Again, sorry I don't have scripts and programs, but for the third or fourth time that I said, I think we all have enough of those. So next slide. Logs and attack. So they go hand in hand. Can you have one without the other? Which one comes first? Personally, I don't really care which one comes first, but I will say there's this whole thing of like, well, don't log everything. Yeah, that's a half truth. That's true, but if you're just starting to collect from an organization, right? If you're an MSSP, like I would probably recommend to enable as much as you can at first. You can turn it off later. You can disable. You can drop it. You can click the magnifying glass with the minus or exclude sign. I'd rather have than have not, sort of thing. But you can gain additional insights based off of logs. I think we all kind of know that, but I think we've all kind of been pre-programmed of applying false positives of signatures to logs. I think it came more from that than really like retention and cost sometimes. Maybe not so much cost, but because over the last 2 years it's kind of changed. But yeah, like, oh, there's too many logs. Well, just like here, I'll close the window for you, open this window, or just drop it, just disable it. But logs are going to help you in the life cycle. You can use logs to help you map new things to attack or find things that attack. Shouldn't say missing, right? But just not going to know the answer to everything. We got scratchy noise still. Is that me? Anyways. Yeah, logs of course are going to help. So just some kind of like known things or kind of quick examples. Wireless Wi-Fi, I always like to talk about, because when I got into cybersecurity, I just would read compromises in Adam. Sorry, I'm about to be done in a minute. And I think it was, I forget which organizations, but the person just sat in the 05 or 06, person hacked a few million credit cards or something, just sat in the parking lot and cracked like the WPA, WPA2, probably WPA at the time, wireless, and then made his way to the point of sale system servers. There's not a lot of like you can find out if you have wireless Wi-Fi. Use MAC addresses in your logs to figure out if you have voice over IP phones, if you have routers, switches. These are all things that are like discovering what's on your network, help you aid in what possibly there is that you're not getting in network diagrams and so on. Once you kind of figure out the concept or idea of what to focus on or is important to the business, or even using these, to help you aid in the process of figuring out what is important. Like usually routers and switches are important. So, because that flies right with uptime, right? Somebody disable or just take down drop packets on a firewall or a router. Yeah, Z Corelight syslog logs, what I always talk about, logs inside of logs. We've been able to use syslog to collect logs from organizations, sometimes passively or whatnot. And then again, as Adam pointed out, with Roberto's brother, Cyber Panda, that's kind of probably been the first article of taking logs down to making it useful, right? But there's a lot to be done, and there was a lot that will never be applicable to everybody. So for once, I think hopefully there's a practical thought exercise, because I've never enjoyed them either. That's it. Or, oh yeah, some other ways to accomplish this: make friends. Maybe not so much easy now, but just one story on this help desk ticketing system. I was troubleshooting some trying to deconflict some pretty suspicious software being installed that did some, pretty high level discovery tasks. Just figured out with the help desk ticketing system, giving context around this situation that, there was a ticket for a computer for an administrator who was troubleshooting something. And that pretty much 90% verified there's a false, negative, positive, whatever. So next, yep.
Yeah. So Nate kind of got into this a little bit previously, but basically one of the problems you can run into with just following attack completely. Hold on one second. I'm about to lose my laptop. Forgot to plug it in. Sorry about that. One of the problems with following attack just strictly is there's new techniques out there, right? Like there's new instances of techniques and adversaries are doing new things. They're not necessarily recycling the same behaviors over and over again. In fact, the best ones are avoiding that completely. So this is also true for vulnerabilities, right? Like there's nothing in attack, like if you have attack 100% covered, quote unquote, which we'll get into that later, but there's going to be lag time between a vulnerability POC being released and your detection, right? And MITRE, the attack framework, doesn't have your back on that. It has like these obtuse categories like initial access through exploitation. Well, that exploitation, exploitation against what? There's 700 million different pieces of software that could be exploited for initial access, probably, right, at this point. So, yeah, just be aware that simply covering every technique completely as it is today, quote unquote completely, doesn't necessarily get you to 100%. It's a cyclical process. You have to constantly be looking out for new techniques, new tools, and we kind of went over a bit in the last talk. So all these are uploaded to our YouTube channel, and if you're interested in where you can find detection content quickly for new techniques and stuff, you can watch that talk. But also the TDM, obviously the threat detection marketplace, is a place to go for a lot of the latest detection techniques. And that's a SOC Prime product. Not to do too much marketing, but it is useful for this.
That was one of one. You're done.
You're done with the marketing. And then there's this issue of overconfidence in detection. So a single rule does not cover an entire technique, sub-technique, mostly. Like there are some techniques out there that are so specific that it's like, okay, yeah, this could be covered by a single detection probably. But for the most part, it takes multiple detections, multiple sigmas or multiple queries, Splunk queries, or whatever system you're using to perform detections. It takes multiple detections to do it. So here's an example, right? So we have this external remote services technique, and it just says adversaries may leverage external facing remote services. Okay, well, there's how many remote services? There's remote desktop, there's SSH, there's web services, VPN, etc. Right? So there's a million of these things. So if we just go and we're like looking online for detection content for this technique, we might go and we might say, okay, this rule has attack T1133, and a T1133 is the technique ID for overconfidence in detection. So we're going to say, hey, I'm covered, man. I got this rule. It says that it's tagged for T113, but if you take a look at the actual logic of the rule, you're going to find that it just has to do with Windows logons from non-public IP space. So it's only really focusing on a minute portion of that technique. So that's what I meant earlier, where like there's this abstraction, right? Just because a rule, even in TDM, is tagged with an attack number, it doesn't mean that you're completely good to go, right? So there is no way for us, unless the only way that you could have a rule that is covering this technique, quote unquote, completely would be to have like 200 plus rules, and then having a meta rule that's alerting on that rule, right? And then that rule, the only logic is, hey, other rules fired that have this technique tagged. So it's like really, you're, like I said, you're losing information when we tag rules, but it's still a useful thing to do, right? So it helps you detect. One of the biggest reasons we're tagging content is because it helps you find it, number one, and then number two, you can do all sorts of cool visualizations, and maybe this will be something for a future talk, but you can do all sorts of cool visualizations on reviewing your coverage by tagging your content. So a lot of sims now are even doing it natively, native, like almost requiring you to tag it with a tag. And this also extends to vendor detections and prevention. So recently, MITRE added the pre-attack stuff directly to the main attack, right? So this is kind of really useful because it makes some things super, it makes certain things like super obvious that you can do a gotcha on a vendor, with a vendor like this guy who says, hey, we have 100% MITRE attack coverage. Well, tell me how you're detecting someone searching open technical databases. Tell me how by installing this EDR, we're monitoring someone going to passive total and looking up information about our environment, right? There isn't a way to do it via EDR, right? You would have to work out something with every passive DNS provider, and even that wouldn't cover it because people can build these databases themselves, right? So if someone says we have 100% coverage on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, then that's the snake oil statement, or just a salesperson who's overstating their capability, right? So be aware that it's not really possible to get 100% coverage. And then Nate, did you have something to add to that?
I just said no way, 100%. Impossible.
Yeah. So then you have overconfidence in data sources, right? Like, so, hey, if I'm a new to an organization, I might go in and I might see, okay, hey, do you guys have Windows logs? Okay. If we have Windows logs, therefore everything on the attack that needs Windows security logs is covered. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You have to make sure that everything has the correct audit policy, that you have multiple layers. So like recently in an engagement, Red Team disabled a EDR platform by disabling event trace, and there was no alert for it. But luckily, we had Windows event logs covering as a secondary source, and we were able to detect them anyways. So by having these multiple layers, we can ensure our detection is there. So if you can afford it, I highly recommend. We're going to see later that process creation, I'm sure everyone knows this, covers a lot of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But if you can afford it, it's best to have an additional at least two sources of that one, especially because people can mess with
Not everybody has process creation, like the longer I've been around, the less and less I still even see it today, Yeah. Were you going to say you can see some of those things being stopped even in like system or application logs in Windows?
No, I wasn't going to bring that up specifically, but so you can like by default, like you can see service stoppage and stuff like that.
Yeah, but as long as they're not using some custom leak code. But then again, like we're at the stage where actors are trying to, as much as possible, like blend in to administrative functions or built-in functions. So it's kind of, worked out in a good way for defenders, Because yeah, you don't have to worry about as much as somebody sending an RCE automatically in memory and then somehow magically pivoting from that box across the airwaves, not on the network, thus creating no logs in the memory into the other computer. No, like along the way, you know, actors are hitting quote unquote landmines or things that are being logged.
Yeah. And then another common problem is assumptions about filtering, right? So Sysmon's a good example of this because there's so many stages where filtering can occur. You can have the Sysmon filter, and then whatever you're using to forward those logs can have a filter on it, like a Splunk Universal Forwarder, for instance, has filtering in it. And then you have filtering at your SIM, or even before your SIM. If you're using something like Kafka, there could be filtering occurring there, getting rid of noise that some like administrator of Splunk or administrator of your SIM just said, hey, there's a lot of con host events, process creation events. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of these because they're taking up, 10% of all the process creation. So we don't really need to see them. It happens all the time. It's normal. Well, they're making an assumption for you. And if you're not aware of who has impact over what's making it to the SIM, go ahead and review that chain of commands of every place where you can lose data. So this is an example for Sysmon, but everyone has this in their environment, and there is filtering going on in your environment. So if you're like an MSSP, it's even crazier because it's probably to their SIM and then filtering further into your SIM, right? And then what's in your AR that you don't know about? This is super common. There's always, well, I wouldn't say always, but there's often like small domains sitting off of your domain or little networks that only physical security for your building knows about. Like these are things that you need to be, like Nate said, making friends and talking to people and asking indirect questions like, oh, what kind of systems do you work on and stuff like that. Like the worst time to learn about a system is when someone calls you up and says, hey, it's ransomware. Then you look at your computer and it's not ransomware. So you're like, oh, it's probably just crimeware. But then you start getting 12 other calls like from some department who just has their own little network and they're all ransomware, right? Like that's not the best time to learn about a network. So you have to make sure you're exploring and talking to people. Sometimes is the best way to learn about those networks or systems out there. So then there's, here's like a slide just to show. I stole this from Jose and Roberto who put this together, but basically process monitoring is huge here. But if someone is able to disable process monitoring, or if it's not available in an environment that you're going into, like you're out of luck because 234 plus 150 is a lot of missed events. So, and then there's also devaluing data sources. Like if you look at this, if you look at MITRE ATT&CK and you say, antivirus isn't important because it only covers 7 techniques according to the folks at ATT&CK or MITRE ATT&CK, right? Well, antivirus is going to is like, it's not maybe the fanciest from a threat hunting perspective, but it's super useful. Like it's going to raise that bar of someone having to get into your network to a point where 90% of stuff is going to be caught, right? So it's doing a lot of work, even if it isn't covering a lot of the MITRE ATT&CK space. So you shouldn't just say, you shouldn't map your data sources and go, oh, antivirus is useless because it's only, if we want to get rid of something, we'll get rid of AV, we'll turn it off or something like that. Like it's not necessarily the case. And the same thing goes with web proxy and web logs. Like just because they don't cover a lot of the techniques doesn't mean that they're not super useful. Yeah, so some quick takeaways. Yeah, techniques change or are used in novel ways, or there's CVEs out there or vulnerabilities that get POC'd or are used as 0 days. So MITRE ATT&CK gets you part of the way there, and then also it'll get you most of the way there if you make it a cyclical process, right? And then if you don't have a lot of information about what adversaries are doing, like if you don't have a mature intelligence team, it's probably best to stick to those quarterly reporting from your big shops that are doing incident response out there and listening to what they're seeing companies be targeted with, because you're more likely to fit that model probably and get more use out of that than just picking 5 adversaries that you think might target you and looking at their techniques. It's my advice there. It's best to have multiple detections per technique and sub-technique, including data sources, right? And then validate vendor claims. Like if someone says, I have 100% MITRE ATT&CK coverage, this tool will save your life, probably not true, and you should take everything that person says with a grain of salt there on. So yeah, so those are the key takeaways I talked about 5. Nate, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, my key takeaway is make your life easier by doing less. Just think about it in Lego blocks.
Yeah.
That's really it. We got Q&A. We'll keep it open. And
yeah, I see Q&A here.
Ask.
But yeah,
I see somebody trolling.
Yeah,
Adam,
sure.
They asked how can log WMI queries. Well, logging WMI queries before took logging ETW, and before ETW, I had there was software to take ETW, put it into Windows logs. Adam wrote a nice little script.
Yeah,
but you can log WMI queries using Sysmon, or if you're a special person like Adam, ETW.
Yeah,
but even
actually,
the Sysmon WMI, you can tell that story.
Yeah, Sysmon doesn't log queries yet, but if you want to log WMI queries, it actually doesn't require that much. Doesn't require much at all. Like you can just enable the log in Event Viewer, like on your box probably. Just go to Event Viewer, go to the application logs, or there's a list of 6 million of them that you scroll down until you get to W and look at WMI activity. And if you enable that log, you're going to see WMI queries in there. And it is. I did write a script that changes that log to a EBTX file that you can ship to your SIM. I wouldn't recommend using that. That was more for like malware labs and small instances and stuff like that. But if you I'm drawing blanks on what they are, but there's several tools now. FireEye has one that allows you to do much easier ETW logging now, and you can look at that channel or that provider.
Yeah, ETW is, we definitely had, that was, I know who asked that question. But what is that tool called? I know NXLog can do ETW, and then of course Roberto has a blog, and the ETW things didn't help.
Yeah.
But
let's see here. We have a question about Symantec.
Yeah, I'm answering that one in the chat.
But real quick, I just wanted to pitch our developer program. So we're looking for folks like you who are interested in detection, maybe who have some experience writing detections, but maybe not. Like it's not too difficult to get into this field. But we have a threat bounty program here at SOC Prime where we pay you for content. So if you're in your free time doing any sort of defensive research at all, you might quickly write a signature for that and submit it to us, and you get paid for that. So I think the average payout this last quarter was like $500 a month for people who submit content. So
yeah, I mean, if you're writing Sigma rules already, or you're building detection content, and even if you don't know Sigma, just replace some variables for the Sigma rule, like, $500 doesn't sound like a lot, but I think the effort, is worth $500 for sure. So, and again, that's like the average or the minimum. So, yeah, you're writing Sigma rules, parsers, dashboards, all sorts of stuff. And again, this is you as a researcher, independent, like you're not coming to work for anybody and things like that. It's like the stuff that most of us do on the weekends anyways, just I'll get some more, buy that new Xbox, I guess.
Yeah. And we have like 3 more minutes, so if anyone has additional questions, we'll answer them. Excuse me. And you can also listen to Nate's scratchy beard. Sorry about that.
Is that what it is?
I think so, yeah. I think it's your beard scratching the mic or
awesome.
something. Yeah. Okay. What's your favorite security conference? Oh, to learn it. All right, hold on. What's your favorite security conference? Man, I personally like the B-sides ones, like because they're mostly free or really cheap to get into, and you're also like there with your local folks most of the time. Like, there's a lot of it's really positive thing to like make friends with people who are in the community around you. So like, I really like B-sides DC. My favorite one before was probably Derby Village. Yeah, go to the lockpicking village.
I like Converge Detroit because Detroit has good food, but I was really looking forward this year. The keynoters were going to be Roberto and Matt Graber, hoping when this thing, goes away that can still happen again. So I'd say Converge in Detroit, U.S. Then outside the U.S., just I don't know, a lot of them seem pretty interesting, to be honest.
Yeah. And then we have one question. Where can I learn more about malware analysis? Yeah, that's a great question. I would say if you haven't taken a look at practical malware analysis, I think that's still like the go-to for getting up to speed. And then if you make it through that book, I would read the book Practical Reverse Engineering by Bruce Dang, who was it? I think he did the research for Flame or Stuxnet for Microsoft. It's really good book, much more challenging, and gets more into like reversing like x86, like actual machine code. And then the other thing is like you just have to do it. Like learn. It's like one of the biggest things you could do to learn how to analyze code is to start writing code to make sure you understand generally how code is written, and then start learning like pulling some .NET samples, like stuff that's been written in C#, because you can decompile it and actually look at the API calls they're making. I think it's a really good way to get into it before you start looking at actual like x86. It's nice. So there's I can't like name anything specifically off the top of my head because that's not how I work. But besides the books, but yeah, look into disassembling .NET, and I would go down that path because it gets a nice balance between it's not as simple as just looking at scripts necessarily, and it gets you more into like API calls and stuff like that. But there's also like there's a lot of like Mimikatz source code is out there, Interpreter's source code is out there. Like you can just look at the source code and start to get an idea of how these tools are working, and you're going to see it over and over again in malware. Like there's only certain there's certain like API call like chains that you're going to become very familiar with, right?
I still like the Mark Rusnovich malware hunting with sysinternal tools from 2013. That's how I taught myself a lot of things. And when usually people ask me like, how can I learn more about malware analysis? Adam kind of hinted at it, but like you just got to do it. It's something that's really hard. Not necessarily to do, but to like really take the time. And sometimes, you can do pretty well with just using like running something in an environment using event logs or sysinternal tools and that sort of stuff. and accomplish that like quasi malware analysis, but enough that you're learning and not necessarily having to go and do assembly code. There's malware analysis of Nate, and then there's malware analysis of Adam. One involves doing something as quickly as possible. The other one involves looking at assembly, which is Adam.
Yeah. Yeah, if you just want to look at like first stage droppers is probably like one of the easiest that you can look at. Malicious word docs, like stay away from stuff that is relying on CVEs and exploits to begin with. Largely, you're probably just going to get frustrated. But if you slowly work into it, you might get to the point. Yeah, like you just have to. It's really like a time thing doing it. So I try to look at a sample like once a month, even if I'm not actively doing malware analysis, just to keep like fresh. Best sysmon config. I don't really have a best sysmon config recommendation, but I do have some exciting news. If you aren't aware, like TDM, we introduced, not to pitch more marketing, but in TDM, or in Sigma now, there's a backend that you can actually convert rules to Sigma configs. So that really works well for those alert-based sysmon configs. Sigma to sysmon config. Works really well for those of you who need to reduce your the amount of alerts you're getting or the amount of data you're sending to your SIM, and you just want to have an alert-based sysmon config. It's kind of like Olaf's modular sysmon, but it works for all Sigma. Well, not all Sigma content, but most Sigma content that's applicable to sysmon. So you might take a look at that. It's pretty cool. How can specific detections be made? Log sources rich with it.
Yeah, I answered that one in chat. How can specific detections be made when a log source is rich with information? Would it be least effort to just like, allow list legit activity and detect everything else? How can this be made as optimal as possible? Yeah, I don't. For certain things, it's you can create an allow list. Like, I wouldn't always rely on it, but like allow lists help reduce noise and things, right? Like, like we said, came from an environment with a few million computers. I think that one was a couple 100,000. But always just talked about like if we were just only able to make sure that DNS was, to the DNS server we controlled, and then just applying something stupid simple at the time was ad blocking, or just literally blocking one domain. Take 30 seconds, stop 5 compromises a year. Who knows how many hours that saves with 5 compromises and everything else. But yeah, it's really hard. The only thing I can say is, I'm a fan of baselining an outlier. Like that's how I've learned so much. As I start at the highest level, and then until I'm basically at the ground or on the floor. It's not necessarily great for SOC automation and whatnot. Not many people have that level of wanting to do something like that, but I've probably learned the most from false positives and that sort of stuff. So I'm a fan of it, but again, like I just break it down into pieces, in the Lego blocks, on how you're using attack, or what, allow your business needs to like drive how you use attack, essentially. Don't go and try to cover every technique, sort of thing. So
yeah, if you're in a small enough environment though, like even if the data source is as rich as something like process creation, like if you're in an environment, I would say, of less than 10,000 hosts, you can definitely go with that whitelisting approach, or allow list is the new terminology, where you're ignoring stuff that is okay, and only looking at a subset of information. Like in some of the smaller environments I've been at, I've literally just dumped like, hey, what were the process creation events for the last 12 hours and did a manual review of them. Even if there was like 500,000 to look at, it was like by using stack counting, it's actually not that big of a chore. It probably took me like 20 minutes. And then I knew for a fact, like, I didn't have to worry about my detections working as well. But to me, it's a mix of doing some of that manual work, but also having some trusty or having a lot of trusty detections that are doing the automation for you in the background. So then you can focus more on that manual and you're not worried about missing something because you're so focused on looking at this rich data source and not looking at other ones instead, right? So it's definitely, if you have that balance of detection content plus manual, like that's awesome.
Yeah, nobody has to stay on. Or just answering questions is kind of over, but yeah.
We'll I think
for another 5, cover a couple minutes if anybody wants to ask anything else. But yeah, I think DNS tunneling is probably one of those things I've seen as a combination of automation and almost always a manual review or a dashboard sort of thing that you can look at every couple days. But yeah, I have never seen a on scale outside of 15 or 20 computers. I've never seen DNS tunneling and ML or AI work almost at all, because essentially every advertising network is a DGA or domain generation algorithm that they use so that can't block their ad domains. So that there is no difference, from a detection level. So other than intent of the domain.
Yeah, I've always been skeptical of machine learning myself.
Well, and then that Facebook red teamer, like all he did was use quad A records, because apparently most everybody's was just looking for A record lookups. So like that, yeah, I mean that's a perfect example even of, of DNS tunneling using A record. Like DNS doesn't really care for the most part. There's not too much variation in really the response of the data that gets sent back. So just change that A record to anything. Got 256 different variables you could use.
All right. Doesn't look like there's any new questions, so we'll go ahead and call it quits. We were able to stay a few extra 10 minutes here, so we hope everyone in the U.S. at least has a really nice. I think Canada celebrates. A lot of Canadians celebrate Thanksgiving too.
Well, then everybody enjoy the Americans not being around. How about that?
Yeah.
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 2-day break from Americans. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know our company will enjoy that from me and you, Adam.
Yep. But luckily, we're a global company, so we have people monitoring our networks 24/7. So don't think about just because Adam's not here, guys. Just kidding. But don't forget the challenges and think about the developer program. So again, have a nice weekend and Thanksgiving if you're celebrating. So, bye.